I've been a lifelong fan of Noah's work. So it came. Can you hear me? I should do it better like this, really. Yeah. So I've been a lifelong fan of Noah's work, like I'm sure all of you here. So it came as a sort of mixture of a confusing mixture of great excitement and pride and a tiny bit of envy when my first professional encounter with him was when my children, both of whom are here, got cast in his movie. And with my husband, we found ourselves in the position of accompanying them to Cleveland, Ohio for many months last summer to be set parents. So I think that this may be a first. I have a feeling that I don't know whether ever has it happened before that a sort of world-class filmmaker has been interviewed at the renowned New York Film Festival by the on-set chaperone. But here you go. There's a first time for everything. So last summer, no one in our family knew Noah or Greta, apart from, as I said, huge fans. But a lot has happened in a year, and they've become a huge part of all of our lives. And it's been a life-changing year for our entire family as a result of this amazing experience that we've all had. And over the course of that year, I got to see Noah in many different, sort of through many different lenses, as I said, first as a fan of all of his movies, and then on the set as a parent, but that is of one of the actors, of two of the actors, and that's an extremely unique and kind of privileged position to be in, because you get to watch this brilliant man make his movie and see it up close and see his process, and also see him mentor my kids and help them understand how to act for the screen, which was just extraordinary. And then he's become a friend, as has Greta, to us all. And I have also managed in the process to segue my kind of momager role and sort of do a kind of like reverse nepotism and use my kids as a way of now collaborating with Noah, and we're working on something together, writing something, but that's another conversation for another day. And I just really, all that is to say that in all these different guises, he's been the kind of just opposite of disappointing in every way. And he's made a movie that is absolutely the opposite of disappointing. It's brilliant, and I'm so excited to talk to him about it today. I watched it again for the third time last night with the aim of like thinking up brilliant questions to ask him, and I just found myself completely engrossed for the third time and completely forgot to think of any questions. And all I really want to do is just gush about it and talk about all my favorite bits, but I know a lot of you probably haven't seen it yet, so I don't want to spoil it, so I think I have to stick to asking sensible questions. But the trouble with sensible questions is that they've all been asked before, and part of there's a thing in the movie which is a sense of déjà vu is an imminent sign that, of a surefire sign of imminent death, and I'm sure Noah must be suffering from terrible déjà vu over the last few days, having been asked just the same question over and over again. And I would like to be able to sort of comfort him by saying that my questions aren't, my familiar questions aren't a sign that he's going to die. But I can't tell him that because he is, as are all of us here. And it's a sad fact, but it's true. But you know, it's okay. and as you'll find out when you watch his movie. So anyway, the first question I think I should talk about, because you know that's the reason I'm here, is about kids and about how you know you've worked with kids over the years, and this film manages to be both a kind of an extraordinary departure and this huge kind of, you know, immense sort of disaster, existential, dystopian movie on the one hand, but also on the other hand, a very familiar Baumbachian sort of intimate portrait of a family. And within that, the way that you work with all the kids in the movie, and the way that you've worked with all of the kids in all of your movies, from Squid and the Whale through Marriage Story and others to this, is fascinating to me. And I felt like part of what they loved, my kids, was how you didn't talk to them like kids. Like you treated them like adults, and they got to be part of your incredibly detailed and specific kind of preparation and process. And anyway, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the way that you work with children, and have done over the years.
Thank you for saying all of that.
Not my pleasure.
Well, I working with kids, part of it is when you're as a scriptwriter who then directs the scripts. I sometimes and I've often written about family and been drawn to family dynamics, and I find myself writing children as part of the storytelling of the sort of particular movie at hand. Obviously, in the Squid and the Whale, it was more from the kid's perspective, and Marriage Story is more from the parent's perspective, but the kid was a very big part of it. But then, as you know, when you write things, and then there is a kind of disconnect. I write knowing I'm going to make it, but I'm also want to keep a certain kind of freedom in the writing and be open to what I feel like the story requires. And then when I turn to it as a director, you're faced with sometimes sort of real challenges, like having kids in very significant roles, and kids who have a lot of dialogue, and that there's going to be a lot required of them from a kind of professional perspective, and that's a challenge. And it was a challenge. I mean, I love, but then what you also get from it is, in all the sort of structure and the sort of professional world around a movie, when you have children, you get something that is totally out of your control. And that's when you find the right ones, that's kind of amazing and beautiful. I mean, it's true of movie making in general. You come at it from a director's standpoint, you come at it with the sense of all of the stuff that you can control, knowing that there's so much you can't. And so, and kids just, animals even, there's another, and the Squid and the Whale had kids and a cat. Best actually professional advice I ever got was from Ethan Cohen, because I told him when I was making Squid and the Whale that I was going to cast my friend's cat in the movie, and he said, "Cast a professional cat." Because even a professional cat is just like, it's what the professional cat can do that an amateur cat can do is, it's a slim. But with children, I find for the sort of the style that I, the way I like behavior in my movies, and is with children, I want people who can hold up to the rigor of making the movie, obviously because it's necessary, but also people who are real people. And so it's often trying to find people who are right on the cusp of both. Maybe they've done a couple things, they've done some things in school, they have an interest in it, but haven't done too much. And you see it in auditions. A lot of times you can tell that they can do it only one way because they've rehearsed it one way with whoever rehearsed it with them. This is true of adults too. But all this is to say is, I think I love it, but it also poses this real challenge. But casting your kids in White Noise, and Raffi Cassidy, who plays their sister Denise, was I would say I mean, this is true with, say, Jesse Eisenberg, but he was older in the Squid and the Whale, and Owen too in that movie. But there was really almost no difference between working with professional actors and they were they're so mature beyond their years, and they were they could do everything required of them. So it was sort of not. It really didn't feel like working with children. But I've had experiences where it's a real challenge, and it takes a lot of your energy and focus away from other things, trying to, trick them that the camera's not on or whatever you're trying to do.
Well, we were so envious, Sandra and I, when our kids would come, and like the first day of rehearsal, they came home with their like Proust's 30 questions for their characters, and we were like, oh God, no one ever gets us to do that, and and all these films to watch and music to listen to, and it was just for them, for that to be their first experience working in movies, it's going to be a hard act to follow, but it was so amazing to watch. But it occurs to me that like that you at the movie is set in. The book was written in 1985, was it?
Or came out in that year.
Yeah, and the movie's set in that year, and when you were still a kid, and I just wondered like what movies you were watching at that time, whether those movies influenced this movie, and whether you knew then that this was what you were going to do.
Yeah, that's a good question, because and it is something that draws me to that period. Squid and the Whale took place in 1986, and I think I picked that year. Well, I picked it for a few reasons, but the mid '80s for me, I was born in 1969, so that mid '80s are really seminal times for me in terms of discovering movies on my own, and my parents were very interested in movies, and so I was quite precocious in terms of the movies I saw, but then I kind of rebelled in went like from like 9 to 13 or something, and I was sort of like things that I felt were sort of, I wasn't interested in foreign movies or anything like that. I wanted to see like, The Jerk or Stripes or things like that. Anyone from Saturday Night Live, because I wasn't allowed to see Saturday Night Live because it was too late, so I would you could see the movies. But then in like 84, 85, I started to go, when I could go into the city with my friends, and we would go see, like David Lynch movies and the Coens' first movie, Blood Simple and Blue Velvet, and She's Gotta Have It, Spike Lee's. It was an exciting, I didn't know it at the time, but I look back, it's a really exciting time for like independent, what would be called independent movies, and a lot of them were New York based in a way, Jim Jarmusch, and so that was exciting also, and they also did play around with genre elements. All of those movies have certain, even Jarmusch's movies have sort of hidden genre, Prison Break and Down by Law, things in them, and that was also coinciding with loving Spielberg and loving the more commercial, the Hollywood movies that were being made at the time, and so I do think all of those, that sort of discovery of those movies is part of, is baked into the construction of White Noise.
Yeah, and were you at that time? Was that what you wanted to? Did you know you wanted to make them?
I did around that time have that idea, but I also thought it was impossible. So, because I didn't know anybody, I didn't know anyone who made movies, or it seemed like it happened somewhere far, far away. But I thought, I would like to do that, so it was a kind of split ambition. It was like, it was both a kind of like, well, this won't happen, but it must happen.
It's funny, I watched E.T. again on the plane coming back from France just this week where I was working, and it really, there was such wafts of this movie in it. I don't know whether that was somehow it is that feeling of being with the kids, and the kids being the kind of the wise ones, and the adults being the idiots, despite being academics and brilliant, and the kids having this sort of just insight and being very watchful, and that, I don't know, they feel like Spielbergian kids in a way.
Yeah, I felt that reading the novel in a way, that they felt sort of like a kind of literary idea of '80s movie kids in a
Right.
way, and Spielberg, I mean, works so brilliantly with kids. I mean, even the kids in Jaws who are less prominent, but they're amazing. The kids in Close Encounters, and then in E.T., they're really central, and there's a grounded quality in those movies that's also mixed with fantasy,
Right.
and in a kind of more maybe straightforward way, in that, you know, we live here, the aliens come here, or whatever. But you know, in White Noise, it's sort of abstract in a sense. But I did see a corollary in that way.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. At that moment when Denise, oh no, but anyway, you guys haven't. I'm not gonna. I better not go on about the moment.
Do we know none of them have seen it? Maybe some.
Has anyone seen it? Oh yeah, a few of them have seen it.
Few of
Okay,
them
but
have seen
still, we'll stay off that. And oh yeah, so the other thing I wanted to ask about was tone and how all your movies that have that sort of walk that incredible line between sort of heartbreak and humor, and which is so hard to do, but so you manage it so expertly, and when you get it right, it just feels like life, you know. And but this is that too, but with the added element of sort of terror and menace. So there's sort of terror, menace, heartbreak, and humor, and I wondered whether it felt different adding in terror and menace, or whether it felt just the same, kind of like. Did it feel like you were just making another movie, or did it feel like you were making a very different kind of movie?
It didn't. I mean, it didn't. I didn't think of it in that way, like I was making a different kind of movie. Although, there were new elements of because it wasn't my original story. I was felt in some ways like a translator. I was like, what I was responding to in the book, I was trying to find sort of cinematic analogs for those things, and that was a different process than what I might be doing when I'm originating the script. But terror and menace always have felt I felt pretty close to terror and menace, whether they appear. There's some terror. There's definitely terror and some kind and a different kind of menace in Marriage Story. I think. Yeah, I mean, it's you know, there's definitely a theme in White Noise. I think of we by hiding from by trying to ward off our death or acknowledge our mortality, we sublimated in our entertainment, in our you know, the kids enjoy it, watching a plane crash footage on television, you know, because it doesn't feel real on some level, you know. And I think people who live through, you know, I mean, everyone here knows this from watching, you know, war on television over the years, whatever war it was. I think Vietnam, obviously, before White Noise, was probably a kind of big version of that, because that was like the first televised war in that way. But that how it feels real and unreal at the same time. Yeah. And then when it comes if you have real tragedy or real menace and terror in your life, how it's almost hard to acknowledge it, because you know it only from this other experience, this other thing. And I think that's sort of brilliantly depicted in the book, and it's sort of part of the movie. It's the and it changes the concept of death, that death is, you know, and I think I certainly went through it. I mean, I think many people I know went through it with the pandemic, which is this, you know, feeling of like, I mean, everyone was talking about Contagion in the beginning. You know, we all must rewatch Contagion, somehow looking for a key to what was going on, because it was inexplicable. We couldn't figure, you know, we didn't have anything, certainly not in our lifetime, to you know, compare it to hold on to, and even the experts didn't. So, you know, so we had Steven Soderbergh, you know.
Then I think I read somewhere that you had talked about I mean, just to talk about the thing of adapting someone else's book, which you've never done before, and that you had talked about Brian De Palma talking to you about that and saying you should do it because it frees you up to be not in your head and to experiment and be kind of free in a way that you might not be if it's the primary source is your own. And I'd love to hear you talk about that, whether that felt, it feels that
well,
way
yeah,
watching
he
it.
was talking about it, working as an interpretive director versus, working from your own script, which he did both. He sort of alternated both throughout his career. Jake Paltrow and I did a long interview with him that we made into a documentary, and but his early movies are all very much from his scripts. I mean, they're thrillers and they're genre movies, but they're very much Brian's obsessions and things. And then he started doing things like Scarface and The Untouchables and, later Mission Impossible, and he talked about working as an interpretive director, that it frees you up. It sort of gets you out of your own thing, and you're able to, in some ways, personalize something that's exterior. And, I mean, there's so many directors who I've gotten to know and become close with, like Mike Nichols and Peter Bogdanovich and Brian, and who are worked almost exclusively as interpretive directors. I mean, Peter wrote some of his scripts, but but you don't think of them as any less personal than a movie from a writer director. I mean, some of my favorite filmmakers like Ernst Lubitsch, Howard Hawks were all technically interpretive directors, but. So I did have that experience in adapting it because I felt like it was mine and not mine, and I was sort of seeing it both inside and outside. I mean, that happens anyway naturally with my own scripts, but because it wasn't my story, it was like I would go back to the book while I was writing to look for clues to things that maybe I had put in that I didn't. I was like, well, why did and I'd have to go back, and it's sort of like having some sort of like map or treasure map that you can't quite figure out, but you can, if you follow it, maybe you'll discover more things.
Yeah, that's so interesting to me, the sort of randomness of ideas, of in the creative process, and how people come up with things, and how an idea starts, and then, as you say, like how you progress, and then you keep needing to fuel the ideas as you go along throughout the creative process, and where they come from. And I mean, it's impossible to kind of talk about or quantify really, but it was cool hearing you the other day in one of the Q&As talking about how you start writing just from snippets of dialogue that you kind of hear in your head, and that's often when you're writing something of your own where you begin, and that from that comes the kind of characters and the relationships and the story even. And I'd be great.
Yeah, well, it's like you find yourself doing it sometimes in an interview. You're like talking until you figure out what you're trying to say, and they ask you the question, and you start making gestures and saying things, and then you're like, all right, and then by the end you're like, oh, and sometimes writing is that way. It's like you're writing this back and forth, or maybe it's just something I overheard, or something someone said that night before dinner, or something that or an experience I'd had, and you just use it as a way to kind of ground yourself in something, and then invent out of it, and you sometimes arrive at something. And then what happens also is, well, if you're writing, you're talking, these characters are talking to each other, and it's like, well, this person said this because I thought of it then. But why would they say that? What kind of person says that? Well, maybe the person is lonely because they said that, or they don't mean it. They said it, but it's, and that gives you character. But you didn't start with the character. You didn't have the idea of this person. Just the line gave you the idea of the person who might say it, and that that's the mystery in all of it, you know, and why it's so hard to talk about sometimes. You know, we talked about the George Saunders book,
Something in the rain.
the pond and the swim in the pond in the rain. You know, but it's George Saunders, you know, the writer has a book where he it's in paperback. It just came out in paperback recently, I think. But it's Russian short stories by different Russian writers, and he essentially has the story and then his sort of, and it's really about writing. And he's very articulate, I find, about sort of a way to explain the mystery, if that's possible.
Yeah, and how it all starts off randomly, somehow, just like you're grasping for ideas desperately.
Well, he has a thing but he has a thing where he makes a comparison to a person who has a train set, and they set up the train set and they have little people for for the town, and they put someone on a bench and they're looking at the thing, and then they see the way the person they put on the bench seems to be looking up at a window, so he put another person up in the window to look down at the person on the bench, and suddenly he has a story, but he didn't set out with that story. He just was open to the story as he was doing these other things. And I think it's kind of a great way to articulate how this happens. And it's also true. It's true in writing for sure, but I find it's true on a set also. You have, you know, things that you're trying to control, and then something happens that gives you an idea for another thing. Or you look at the set, you look at the location, and you say, oh, well, but the door, in my mind, the door was there, but it's here. But that actually means that, oh, but that would help. And then you come up with a whole new thing. And all you're doing is reacting to the environment. You're not, you know, and then later somebody's like, I love how you did, you know, and it's, you know, but but that is the thing, is being open to that. I mean, some people are so open to it that they like to improvise on set, and actors, and that isn't for me, because I find, you know, I want to be as open as possible in the writing process and take as much time as I need with that, but then I like to have that fixed, because that to me is a way for us to keep our feet on the ground while we are open to other things.
Yeah. Well, that's another question I had, was just the way that the movie transforms, but from writing to shooting to the edit, and you know, like the sort of living, breathing organism that it is, and how surprised are you by those different stages, and do those different stages often completely change your understanding of the movie, or not really? But
it depends on the movie. I mean, I don't know that I've had it. I'm trying to think. I mean, this is one of those things where I may talk and then realize what I'm saying. But I don't think I've ever had it so much so that it suddenly became a different kind of movie than I thought it was. But that doesn't mean, though, often, I mean, I've said this before, but I essentially set out thinking I'm making a comedy every single time. And I seem to not be much of the time, according to other people. But I think I am. But I'm also totally open to that other thing. I mean, I like that what I'm sort of doing, or what I might find funny. It's funny because maybe it's true, which also makes it not that funny. Yeah. And I'm that's totally fine. You know, I don't feel like. I think my movies, often people laugh or cry in different places sometimes, and I think, you know, probably from a commercial perspective, people would say that's totally not what you want to be happening. Everyone should be laughing at the same time and crying at the same time. But I like that. I think it's the same way we all have different experiences. You know, with each other. You know, someone goes home, oh, that had such a good time, and the other person felt totally insulted and hurt or something. And so I'm very much open to that. But you're asking about the edit. I mean, I think some movies cut very close to the script. Marriage Story was pretty close. I mean, there's always things that that change and go out and all of that. But others, I mean, this one also because there were things I took from the book, there are things I had to edit out of the book, obviously even going into the script stage. And then there were things we shot that I took out of the edit because it didn't work in the flow of the movie. But it's really, each one is its own adventure, and you kind of both have the experience that you're bringing into it and what you can, essentially know you can expect. You generally know you can expect that the scene that you're the most troubleshooting is actually easier to cut than the scene you didn't think about much at all, and then suddenly you're like, this one's a disaster. Like it's always the one that you think is the problem when you get into the edit is not. I feel like that's almost, I can count on that. But then there's always new things and things that you don't have no idea. I mean, you are an amateur every time you do it again. And that's.
That's the fun of it.
That's the fun of it, and the terror and menace of it. Yeah.
It's interesting, the sort of the watching you do it, that the sort of on the one hand, the extreme preparation and attention to sort of detail and just everybody has to be off book from day one of on set, and there's a lot. Well, in this one particularly, I think more rehearsal than any of your other movies, but probably always there's some rehearsal, and everything in the rehearsal sort of worked out in terms of where people are going to go, and it's very kind of choreographed, and yet it doesn't feel like, it's almost like, I remember Alessandro, my husband, who's an actor, did work with Robert De Niro, and he was very surprised. He's worked with him a couple of times now, but the first time, by how obsessed he is by learning the lines, like months in advance. De Niro, like he never thought that was something that was necessary. He didn't associate that with Robert De Niro somehow, but he said he was just like, that was really his thing, which is like to be absolutely word perfect months and months in advance. And Sandro has since copied him, and says it does make a real difference because it gives you freedom. Like the more prepared you are, the more free you can be when you get to doing it. And it would just be cool to hear you talk about that. But I feel like that's what
I think that's something I feel very strongly about. A story that did you ever know Ulu Grossbard, the director? He made. Is anybody here? He made Straight Time with Dustin Hoffman, which is an amazing movie, and he made True Confessions, which was a Joan Didion, John Gregory Dunn. It was from a John Gregory Dunn novel, and with De Niro and Robert Duvall, and he made a lot of really wonderful movies. He made Georgia with Jennifer and Mare Winningham, and he used to work as Elia Kazan's. I think he was his stage manager on stage, and then he worked even like as an AD on maybe some of the movies, and he became a director. But he told me this story because the original Death of a Salesman that Elia Kazan directed with was it Lee J. Cobb, and they did, it was a huge success. They ran it on Broadway, and then it was like a year later they were cutting a record album of it. But none of the actors had done the show for a year. And so Ulu was tasked with sort of directing he had been the stage manager, so he was directing the record. So they all got around the table, and he said they had their scripts open because they hadn't done the play in a year, and they all started in the beginning sort of reading their lines. And he said, but the muscle memory, they all then just started saying the words. And he said it was the best acting he'd ever seen because everything was just there, but not totally memorized. And it was like they knew it from some far off place, so they were all arriving at it as they were saying it. And I thought that was fascinating because I think that is the ideal, is that the actors would know it a year in advance, 6 months in advance, or whatever it is. And that's what I try to do on the movies, is as soon as I can to say, if you can just start learning it, because then it's like present and not present at the same time. Yeah. And I told that story to Mike Nichols, and he said, that's what improv was, because he, Lane May, famously did improv, and he said improv was just that. He's like, you're not thinking about what your character would say or what your motivation is. You're just so excited to have something on the tip. You're going to just say it, and you're just saying it, and that's is sort of what you want all acting to be, I think. And it's easier said than done, I guess.
Should I ask some questions? Yeah, I mean, do you guys want to ask the question? Are there any questions from the audience?
We've answered them all.
Yes, you.
Hi.
Hey, we have mics, sorry. Just so you can be on the video.
Oh, great. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you both. This has been really educational so far as someone who is about to attempt adapting a short story into a feature film. And I've heard that, I forget who said this, but like novels are more adapted into TV shows and short stories into feature films. And I guess I'm curious about the nuts and bolts of how you contended with this, pretty intense novel. Like, did you outline? Did you kind of read it over and over and just start writing? Or how did you go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, Joel and Ethan Cohen, I think when asked about how they adapt a book, Joel said Ethan holds the pages open and I type, or maybe it was, and there is a little bit of that in the beginning of adapting a book. I find you are just sort of typing it into a final draft, and seeing how it's going to go.
All the best bits.
Yeah, all the best bits. But with this book in particular, because if you know the book, the first part and the last part of it are they're a bit more elliptically told. They're sort of shorter chapters. There's a lot of sort of cyclical, almost episodic things. So returning to, again, I think in the part one, it's a lot of like ritual. They're back in the supermarket. They're back and it has this kind of cumulative effect as you're going. And but I saw less clearly immediately how I could open a movie that way. So, but the middle part of the book, which is this, the airborne toxic event, it's called. It's essentially a disaster story. I mean, it's a disaster film in the movie. But it's linear, and it's they get evacuated, they go here, they run through the woods, and so I started with that because I felt like, well, let's just even see if this works in a movie. And I've never done that before. I essentially am writing the middle of the movie before I'm writing anything else. And at that point, I wasn't even sure I was going to do it. I didn't even have the rights to it. I was just doing. As I started getting into it, I was like, I better figure this out. But that helped me then when I went back to the first part and the third part to try to understand how I could kind of tie a thread through something that was, by design in the book has a different rhythm, and a movie sort of, I think to what whoever said that, that there is that thing with a short story because it's, essentially just more manageable, and it's, and that you can maybe find an ABC in terms of a movie, but that was the sort of challenge in a way. It was supposed to winnow it down and also to draw a thread. I mean, there are all these sort of they're big things in the book. I mean, there's this pill, Dylar. There's this cloud that comes. There's this character in a motel at the end. There's Babette and her secrets, and essentially I find in a movie, which is different than in a book, that to find a way that I could link all of these as part of the same story. Whereas, I think again, in a TV show or something, people are more open to sort of episodes and things. And in a movie, it's a kind of tumbling, you're tumbling towards a conclusion because there is a conclusion. And in television, often there isn't one.
So I read the book a couple of months ago, and I thoroughly enjoyed every part of it, especially the longer conversations in the book between Murray and Jack. And I feel like I noticed last night when I watched the movie that a couple of parts that I really enjoyed were taken out. And I was just wondering how you decide, well, they weren't taken out, but the scene itself wasn't there. It was placed into a different part. Like specifically, actually, I'm not going to give it away because I know some people haven't seen it. But how do you decide to put something in and not keep the scene while kind of keeping that tumbling flow to the conclusion like you were talking about and still upholding the idea of the book? How do you choose to include something and insert it somewhere that it wasn't in the book? Because I feel like that's one of the most important parts of adapting something.
Yeah, I think earlier on in adapting, you might be more, particularly with a book like that one where there's so much good stuff, that I was drawn to try to include as much of it as I could. And but this is great too, and I've got to this and this. At a certain point, once it's a script, and once it's sort of in a way it's now mine, I have to find a way to I have to now be faithful to the script and not the book, and figure out what that is. What does this movie require in my mind? I mean, a book like that, of course, you're going to have, if everybody in this room made a movie of that book, they could all be wildly different, and they would all include different parts of the book, and they would all, and often I would go back to the book, sometimes looking for a clue, like I said, if I was looking, or looking for a line or something that maybe I was going to, if I was rewriting a scene or something, and then I would stumble on all these things that I hadn't put in, and I'd be like, "That's so good. Why can't I?" And so, I think it's, you kind of do it knowing, in a sense, it's never going to be. It just becomes its own thing. And you have to be proud of that and go with that. I mean, when Don DeLillo, before we started shooting, he signed a copy of the book for me, and he wrote, "Your movie, my novel. We're now partners, forever," or something like that. And but that acknowledgement that, of course, it was never going to be, it was always going to be something new and different.
Getting back to casting again, you've had an uncanny skill at casting certain people that fit the characters you've written. You kind of knew who would fit and how to place them. Here you're dealing with a book where, these aren't initially your characters. So there has to be I don't know, did there have to be a different approach to casting? And did you have a set of people in mind that you felt were appropriate to this, or you wanted to find people that would be unique to you and to the experience of this book transformed into your movie?
Well, I in a sense, I looked at it like, in some way of using, certainly in regards to Greta and Adam, who I've worked with many times, is almost like thinking of it like a repertory company, and we're now doing this play, or this thing, and so I got interested in the book and adapting the book, and then I sent it to both of them while I was still working on it, even just to gauge their interest. Send it to Greta. I crossed the table, and so, and Greta cast herself as Babette. I didn't have anything to do with it. And I just listened to her. And then Adam, because Adam isn't an obvious choice for that character, there's something I felt appropriate and exciting about casting people who weren't necessarily, like what the internet would cast them with, or the algorithm would cast them. That it was, again, thinking of that sort of idea of like a repertory company of like, we're all going to put on wigs and makeup and we're going to do these parts. And and I felt that that was right for the tone of the movie, because that it was in some ways feeling performance was actually more right for this movie. Whereas in my other movies, it's often about stripping away performance. You know, this was a thing I think I rambled and stumbled into in another interview. I'll try to make it shorter and pithier now. But I was thinking the way I naturally write dialogue, the dialogue is quite stylized and quite rhythmic, but the way we play it it appears naturalistic. You know, and probably if somebody else directed it, you could feel there's a way to play it that would feel more artificial or more, you know, it's interesting to me, David Mamet, you know, the movies or plays that he didn't direct of his work versus the ones he did, because he's clearly interested in the sort of artificiality of his dialogue, and then other directors have played it very naturalistically, and I think it's very interesting to look at both. I only have my own experience in my own dialogue, so but that's how I design it to be, is to play it, you know, in a way that doesn't call attention to itself, but observe the rhythms and observe all the way the phrasing, the thing. It's all very specific, but I feel like it can be played that way. DeLillo, in a way, was almost going the other direction, because the dialogue is quite stylized, and so by design it's going to feel stylized. So I felt in a way, not that they weren't playing it naturalistically, they were, but they were also acknowledging performance. They were playing sort of outside themselves as well. So that's what was kind of exciting to me about Adam playing that part, and you know, or Don coming to play Murray, and you know, that there was a sort of, you know, a little bit of, again, that thing where just like everybody's feet came off the ground just a little bit.
Oh my goodness, I've got to get someone in the back. You with the glasses. Yes.
Hi guys. It's really nice to see the two of you. My mind is exploding. So Noah, you and Greta have talked a lot about how before you guys start shooting, you like the script to be a very set document. You don't like to leave a lot of room for improv when you're shooting. So when you're doing an adaptation like this and you do have to condense a story into less than 3 hours, what do you do to be able to take the liberties you need to complete the story while also making sure that there's still no room for improvisation on set?
Yeah, well, I had to sort of give myself permission at a certain point to change dialogue from the book, or add dialogue. You know, that the book, you know, because there are aspects of the movie that within scenes and also within the movie that go in different directions slightly. So I wrote. There's original dialogue in there as well, and so I'm in a sense writing in the style of the book, and which was I found. I really enjoyed, because I mean it was daunting in the beginning for sure, but I felt I could kind of approximate, you know, things that, you know, and I would find myself writing things that I thought, oh, I believe that was part of the book, you know, you know, but of course I'm working off of the landscape that he's presented for me, which is wonderful. So it's just, I think part of it is sort of what I was saying, is that once it's in a script, and once I've been through it a few times, it is now a script, and I'm not looking at the book as much anymore, and I'm now really looking at that, and then I'm just tinkering, and I'm rereading, and I'm changing lines, and I'm doing things, you know, because I'm now responding to the story and the characters as they are in this movie. So, which is kind of is that what happens too when you get to the edit? You would never consult the script when you got to the edit, would you? Every so often you do, but that's more because often, sometimes if like a take feels funny to me, I'll check to make sure that it's the right line right line from the script, because sometimes if somebody's inverted something, it often throws it off in my mind. But No, you don't really. And yeah, the edit is another rewrite, as people have talked about. And there's always things, no matter how many times I've done this, where there are things that in a script seem necessary, like you wouldn't cut them in the script. You're like, well, we need that scene. Of course we need that scene. That's how we know that, how else do we know they own a dog or whatever, whatever it is. And then once there are human beings saying the lines in real locations and real things, that, the dog has been there the whole time. No one has to be told, or some, I don't know why. That's a terrible example. But there are always things that change. There's always, I think, often, and it happens. There's always something that you don't see coming, no matter what. But it is that thing of like acknowledging that the script is essentially a blueprint of sorts, and then the movie becomes what you have to work with. I mean, what I find exciting about editing, and what I love about editing, which has less terror and menace in a way than writing does, because writing it's anything is possible. You can do anything. I mean, and that's the problem, and that's the challenge, and so you're faced with your own limitations, in the limits of your imagination or the limits of whatever it is. And then in editing, you have built-in limitations because you just don't have that scene, or something. So you're really challenged sometimes to. I used to be scared of it, but now I like kind of almost finding myself backed against a wall in an edit and being like, oh, how am I going to get out of this scene? So, it might be something just even visual, like, I cut some big thing and now they have a hat on, and you're like, well, how are we going to, how did the hat get on them? Or something like that. But other times it's something, more nuanced than that. And it's like you working within those parameters, I find kind of thrilling, because it forces you to get creative in ways that you wouldn't, normally go. And sometimes necessity is the mother of invention. You come up with something great and better, and sometimes you just didn't get it, Someone else in the back.
The lady in the back with the glasses.
You're only calling up people with glasses.
Hi. First of all, I want to say, May and Sam, you are amazing in the movie.
Yes, yes.
My question goes back to casting. Noah, you and Adam Driver seem to have this amazing bromance going on. You keep going, Adam keeps going back to you, you keep going back to Adam. What is it about that relationship that keeps bringing you two together? And please don't stop.
I think in a very basic way, I think Adam is the most exciting actor, one of the most exciting actors working right now. So, I do think this goes back to, when you cast somebody in a way, we were talking about working with children, that in a sense you're inviting someone in that by design is a rebellion against your authority, because if they're particularly young, they're only going to be themselves, and so whatever you need and require from them from the story is going to be something you have to, with Adam, of course, you have somebody who's incredibly skilled but he's also constantly surprising me, and so I have one of my criteria, I suppose, when I'm directing, when I know I have a scene, is it's essentially when I hear it. It's like listening to music. It's like when I feel like it's the song I have in my head. But then people like Adam will change. It's like, we'll change the rhythm or do something different, because not for in any kind of even deliberate way, just because something in the moment of the scene has changed how he's feeling the line and going to say it. And it's a kind of benign rebellion in a way, and it will often improve or excite me in a way that changes even and betters what I had in my head. And that's just one example, but he's incredibly reactive to the moment, but he's also knows every line down to the ellipses, and so he's both interpreting it how he knows that I like it to be done, but he's doing it, it's alive, and that's the thing. So, you know, if I just hired people and all they did was sort of say the words kind of, it's like it's not actually what I want. What I want is this sort of benign pushback. And that's something that he, I think is brilliant at, I mean, there are only, I've worked, with many amazing actors, and there's the scene Greta does in the movie, in White Noise, her sort of confession scene where she sort of breaks down, where the emotion is so raw and true, and it's the thing that it can't be faked, and you're watching it and this is someone really feeling this sadness, and yet at the same time it's totally telling the story, and she's playing the character. And Greta and Adam, Adam has done that many times for me, but in a Marriage Story, the scene where they have their argument, their big fight, that's a scene where he is essentially having a truly emotional experience as a human being, and also playing the part and the character and the story and the scene, and playing and following all the blocking and doing, and to have that, you write these things, sometimes you write something that's incredibly demanding and your kind of movie depends on it, and there you are on the day, and now they've got to just do it. And I can't, I have all day for actors who will bring themselves, with all the distraction and all the stuff that's going on the set, and can just actually both be themselves and be the part at the same time. It's remarkable.
I think we have to stop. I'm so sorry. But thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Noah.
Thank you, Emily. Yeah, it was great. Thank you.